Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for coming. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Matthew Hornsey as a speaker in this Institute for Climate Risk and Response seminar series, inaugural speaker. Oh, fantastic. So Matthew's joining us from University of Queensland Business School. He is known for developing insights around three themes: projection of science and technology, environmental behaviour, and intergroup relations. And in each domain, Matthew's developed unique models designed to understand the logic behind supposedly irrational behaviour and use them to facilitate attitude and behaviour change. He's been a very successful researcher in terms of grant outcomes. Recently got a discovery project, and just before that, he was successful in getting an ARC Laureate Fellowship, which will start next year. And the focus of that is going to be on net zero, and I think we're going to hear a little bit about some of your plans for that.
Yeah, a little bit. Thanks, Ben.
Okay.
Yeah.
Over to you, Matthew. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for coming along. Yeah, I'm kind of going to be. I got involved in this world because I was interested in why do people reject apparently reasonable messages, and I kind of morphed into climate skepticism because that was the thing at the time, and then I've done a bit of stuff on anti-vax, etc. But I'm going to diplomatically refer to just climate change in action just broadly in this talk, but a lot of the foundation is my work on skepticism. I'm going to open with this quote from the documentary An Inconvenient Truth, which is probably still the most famous piece of climate activism of all time. Al Gore at the end finishes with a call to action. It's very much an individual call to action. It's like you as individuals, the choices you make matter. If you defeat this, if you are mindful about your consumption choices, the car you drive, etc., this is exactly what you should do, right? This is very intuitive, and it's just psychology 101. You've got to make individuals feel as though they can do something to respond to this problem. I would have done exactly the same thing. I guess the counterpoint to it is that some people argue that if every individual on the planet enacted every recommendation at the end of this documentary, it wouldn't necessarily be enough to mitigate climate change, because the problem doesn't always lie just with individuals and their consumption patterns. If you think about production in particular, you're really focusing on system level, structural level, industry level producers. And so some people argue, well, this focus on individual consumption is just a bit of a distraction, right? Skepticism about this only grew because one of the all-time great polluters, BP, in 2000, were concerned about how to pivot their brand in the climate change era. They hired a PR company, and together they developed the carbon footprint, right? And the carbon footprint calculator. That was a BP invention. And so for a lot of people, that was like, aha, that's the proof, right? This is a neoliberal con. This is a strategy. It's like, don't look here, look over there. The responsibility is on you, right? So this is like a viral message. And I was very aware when I was going for the laureate that one of my biggest challenges was the perception that I was just a psychologist, and psychologists only look at the individual, and that people would have an issue with that, because there's sort of like a growing stigma in the broader social sciences around that type of approach. And so I spent a lot of time engineering the grant to say, no, I'm not just that. But I still had two of the three reviewers say, aren't you just that? Aren't you just focused on the individual? How's that going to help? Even within psychology, of course, there's been a lot of discussion around this. This is sort of a viral commentary piece saying that a lot of interventions historically have privileged the individual, framed around individual change, but what they need to be doing is being framed around system level change. So within psychology, I mean, this paper only came out a few months ago. It's already been cited 130 times or something. There's a reckoning around this as well. And so I feel as though the zeitgeist, particularly in the social sciences, is don't focus on the individual, okay? Just focus on systems. Where I'm heading with this talk, as you can tell from the title, is that I don't think there needs to be a dichotomous trade-off between the individual and the system. That, to me, climate change in action is an alliance between individual vested interests and collective vested interests, and the two need each other to work, right? And so interventions need to operate potentially at both levels, but that's just a spoiler for where this is going to end. So I'm going to be talking in the first half of the talk. It's sort of like the pessimistic, depressing part of it, where I talk about how did collective best interests turn the climate science debate into a debate when it shouldn't be a debate at all, right? So how did it get drawn into the culture wars? And then the second half of the talk, I'll try and get a bit more optimistic and talk about, well, if we know that, what can you do about it? In a polarized world, how do you create change? Right? So let's just focus on that first question on the left. I always come back to this book. I don't know how many of you have read it or maybe seen the documentary, but it's a couple of historians and they've got a whole book on how scientists vested interests scramble science. And there was a chapter on climate change, and they get like radically specific about the origin story of climate denial. And they focus in particular on these three guys, right? There's three guys, they're not climate scientists, they're physicists, nuclear physicists, very big in their community and very close to government, virulent anti-communist views. Some of them are refugees from Eastern Europe. And they had an issue with the climate science. Now, they're not climate scientists. These are minority voices in the scientific community. But these voices got magnified by various conservative think tanks. Like, where did these think tanks get their money from? Well, from a range of places, but certainly fossil fuel industry directly and indirectly funded that. And I think by like 2010, they estimated that the top 100 of these climate contrarian movements were getting about $100 million US a year. So it's not a trivial amount of funding to launch a campaign. The sort of pro-big business, anti-big government rhetoric that was associated with this debate, called the year of conservative politicians, and then their voices get magnified by the conservative media. And before you know it, there's this, what I would describe as a semi-organized, semi-coordinated campaign of misinformation designed to spread the message that the science was not climate change, right? Even though it was. So it's very similar to the tobacco wars that went on in the 20th century. And the campaign was incredibly effective. It's good sometimes to go back in time and reflect on what things used to be like. So this is Gallup poll, representative poll of Americans in 1997. They're asked whether they agree with the statement. It becomes sort of like a proxy for your belief in climate change. And you can see that the story here is an education story, that more educated people are more likely to be on board with climate change. You couldn't really tell how people voted from their views on climate change back in 1997 in America, right? It wasn't a player. So in a minute, I'm going to show you more representative polls 15 years later, asking almost exactly the same question, right? Let's see how this pattern changes. Okay, now you absolutely can tell how people vote on the basis of their views on climate change. It's almost like a proxy for how you vote, right? And you see the education pattern. Okay, that the polarization is greater for the more educated people. That was an incredibly robust effect back in the day. Harder to find now. I don't have time to riff about why that might be, right? But if anybody saw my talk yesterday, one of the things that I was talking about is how education, literacy, information is not necessarily the salvation. That in some ways, with education, the ability to polarize. That's not just an American phenomenon in Australia, it's probably the world leader right now in terms of climate skepticism. And I'm talking old-fashioned climate skepticism, which is like, well, we're not causing it, this is natural fluctuations. If I want to know what Australians are thinking about anything, I don't go to any kind of academic surveys, etc., because there's often rampant self-selection biases. You go to people like Essential Research, because that's their whole business model, is being able to predict elections and stuff like that, to know exactly what people are thinking, and that's their skill set. And they've been asking questions around climate, actually the same questions since 2009. I think this is the last time they asked it in October 2021. And a lot of people I talk to are surprised by this because they think that the debate is over around climate change in Australia, and now it's just about getting governments and industry to do the right thing. But you look at the 3 out of 10 Australians, everyone accepts that the temperatures are going up. Everyone accepts that, but they think it's primarily natural, that if we try and mitigate it, there's probably no point, right? And then like 1 in 10 people are saying, well, who can possibly know in this topsy-turvy world what's going on with climate change? You know, this is after 50 years of concerted, intense scientific messaging around this, just ringing the bell constantly. 4 out of 10 Australians are going, no, I don't buy it. Right? The central research, I said that they've done 25 of these polls going back to 2009, and they just handed over their data, which is really sweet of them, and they just gave it to me for free. Anyway, so this is just a big dumb regression predicting climate change skepticism in Australia over that time. And you can see, you know, less educated people are more climate skeptical. Rural people are more climate skeptical. Men are, older people are, but it's all blown out of the water by this, right? It's like, who do you vote for? So here's the question that was sort of puzzling me a little bit. It's like, if there's going to be this big campaign of misinformation, why would it just be like taking off among conservatives? Why wouldn't there just be a rising tide of skepticism across the population? Why would it be channeling down kind of ideological paths? There's a couple of explanations for that. And one is sort of a bottom-up explanation, which is about worldviews. And the argument is that baked into the ideology of many conservatives is the worldview that governments don't have the right to tell us what to do, right? And they don't have the right to interfere with the markets, right? So just basically a belief in small government. And if you do have that worldview, and you know, half the planet probably does, climate science is sort of a nightmare, right? Because the solution to climate science in many ways does imply a big government response that will regulate your ability to do whatever you want and does regulate the ability of industry to do whatever they want, right? And for some people, that's just not annoying or inconvenient. That's actually morally obnoxious. That actually really insults their worldview. And so what do you do in that situation, right? Like, it's incredibly tempting, rather than to come on board with a solution that you hate, it's incredibly tempting to reject the science that implies that solution, right? So this is what they talk about solution aversion. Right? So you engage in a process of motivated reasoning, selectively attend to the evidence in a way that dismisses the need for change. I did a meta-analysis back in the day. It's getting a bit old now, but there's maybe 180 studies in the academic literature measuring belief in climate change. And one thing that really popped out for me was these ideological variables, right? Where do you stand on the relationship between the rights of the individual and the rights of the collective? Do you think that status and power hierarchies are normal and natural parts of life, or are you more egalitarian? Right? Do you believe in the free market? Right? Individualists, hierarchical people, and free market fans are less likely to believe in climate change, which is fine, but it's just the size of that effect. You see that these measures have nothing to do with science. They've got nothing to do with the climate, but they outpredict things that you think would be pretty proximal. Have you actually personally experienced extreme weather events like droughts and floods, etc.? Well, if you have, you're more likely to believe in climate science, but anyway, it's incredibly small. Scientifically literate and educated people are more likely to believe it. But again, it's pretty puny if you think about it. There's a lot of people out there think this is all you need to know, all right? The second explanation is more of a top-down thing. It's not incompatible with the first explanation, but this is not so much that people have got a sophisticated ideological worldview, and then they go through this process of motivated reasoning. It's probably more an automatic heuristic thing. It's like, you know whose team you're on politically. And in a country like Australia, where views on climate change did become politically polarized, you just learn your lines. Right? So this is my team, and this is what people on my team are saying, and you heuristically accept that as an expression of identity, as an expression of loyalty. So I see it as a social identity kind of process. In the literature, they talk about elite cues, and there was famous work done by Brawl and Carmichael and others where they waved their hands around various polls in the early 2000s, looking at what predicts climate change concern. And it was heavily influenced by these top-down kind of statements. As people were trying to work out where they sat on this issue, it was heavily influenced by top-down statements from politicians, much more so than extreme weather events that were happening at the time, much more so, as you probably imagine, than the scientific coverage, which people don't really necessarily expose themselves to. I think that it pops out a little bit in the meta as well. So this is no longer academic literature. This is polls from around the world and just looking at the demographics. And really, there's not a huge pattern. Like when I did this at the time, there was a narrative that the problem was with this white male conservatives But the white male part of that algorithm didn't really pop in this, but the conservative thing definitely did. And it wasn't actually in this data set, political ideology mattered, but what mattered even more was whose team are you on, who you're planning to vote for. So it's almost like, you know, your views on climate change become part of your political gang colors, right? I was getting nervous at this point because all my insights were coming from Australia, which is kind of an outlier in a way. And like 50% of the data from that meta-analysis came from America, which is, you know, a big country, right? So I was like, and I kept on getting Europeans essentially like nagging me, going, this doesn't fly. And so I was like, well, is this an international phenomenon? At the time, the only way to really answer that question was just to collect your own data on it, which I did. And apologies for the messy slide, but it's actually pretty straightforward. So this is just 25 correlations in different countries around the world. In this case, I mean, we had different measures. This one is about political conservatism and climate skepticism. Here's America, right? So that's a 0.44. Here's 0, the vertical dotted line. So anything to the right of that is a positive correlation. So America was an outlier, as it turns out. Here's Australia, 0.3. It was a clear second. And there's a few other countries where we saw this positive relationship. But I mean, the overall pattern is like, there's not much going on, right? 3/4 of these countries, there wasn't like a super reliable relationship between being politically conservative and being climate skeptical. So I was like, well, there's nothing inherent to being conservative that makes you climate skeptical. You know, what is going on? Why is there that fluctuation across the 25 nations here? I did a bunch of meta-regressions to try and work that out. And really only one thing popped out, which is a nation's per capita carbon emissions. So the higher a nation's per capita carbon emissions, the stronger that relationship between being right-wing and being climate skeptical. I don't know why, right? I'm just going to guess and I can't prove it. But to me, it makes sense from a collective best interest point of view, right? So these measures are 90% about production, okay? Probably 10% about whether you switch your lights on and stuff like that. It's 90% about production. So it becomes a proxy for mining interests and fossil fuel interests in your country. So the way I see this is when the stakes are high, economically, only when the stakes are high, does the system bother engaging in these coordinated campaigns of misinformation to train and coach conservatives what to think about climate change. If the stakes aren't high, if you don't really have great like vested interests collectively in your nation, then why bother going through that process? Right? So it's a very nation by nation kind of process. I feel like there's a bit of, I haven't published this data, but a bit of circumstantial evidence for this in other data sets as well. This is actually a bunch of Greek IT people dumped this big Twitter data set last year. So they just used machine learning. They kind of harvested all these tweets around climate change and then used machine learning to code them for how skeptical they are and also how aggressive they are, right? Which I thought was interesting. And so I was like, let's have a look at patterns. And from a vested interest point of view, I was like, well, the high per capita carbon emission regions in the world, will they have more skeptical and aggressive discourse around climate change? And this is a great data set. The problem is it's all English, right? So the international data set's like, oh, really? But so we started by just looking at America, just looking at the 52 states in America, who each have their own per capita carbon emission data. And I won't show you all the multi-level modeling, etc., but the scatter plot, there's a relationship there. Right? So the higher the per capita carbon emissions in the state of America, the more climate skeptical they are in the public discourse on Twitter, and the more aggressive both sides are, right, around that, right? So to me, that's a culture wars pattern. That's particularly the case where the stakes are high. I don't really trust the international data, but we did get, oh, by the way, this was controlling for the GDP within the nation, controlling for gender, which they also sort of coded, and controlling for how they vote, you still get this effect. So it's not just, well, there's red states and blue states, and that's all you need to know. Controlling for that, you still get this effect. We got the effect internationally as well. It's just that I feel nervous talking about it because it's just English. What does that mean? There's the scatter plot. I'm going to show you all the numbers. Here's Australia. There's America. So the higher the per capita carbon emissions of the country, the more climate skeptical they are, the more aggressive the debate is. All right, so when I when I talk about this, like in some countries, their eyes are glazing over because they're like, that's just, I'm sorry that you have this situation in Australia. I'm sorry America has this situation, but that's not true in other parts of the world. So I want to take a little diversion. Okay, this is a little parentheses thing to talk about a different worldview. Probably the trending political worldview right now is not so much left and right, it's the populist dimension, right? So populism relies on dichotomizing the world into elites who are kind of cold of heart and abusive and that don't care about common people, and then ordinary people who are virtuous, hardworking, and constantly exploited by the elites, right? Sometimes if you run that populist argument, scientists get dragged into that kind of elite category, but anyway. So that, at the moment, is disproportionately represented among right-wing politicians, but you can also have left-wing populists, and it sort of is orthogonal. It also overlaps with what I'm going to be talking about here, which is the conspiracist worldview, which is another sort of anti-elite worldview, which is that this is the way the world works, right? That groups of elites, powerful people, band together and they organize, and they conduct these elaborate hoaxes on the public with malevolent intentions, and they get away with it. They do it in near perfect secrecy, right? So if you think that's the way the world works, and it's naive to think anything else, you have a conspiracist worldview. And you're more likely to be open-minded to any individual conspiracy. You don't believe every conspiracy going around, but you're sort of open-minded to all sorts of unofficial accounts of reality, right? So let's just talk about conspiracy theories in climate science, because they're rampant. And in fact, if you accept that there's near unanimous agreement among climate scientists that this is happening, and you still refute it, you have to be a conspiracy theorist in some way. You have to believe there's a conspiracy. So the notion that climate change is a hoax at one point is probably the most famous conspiracy theory in the world, right? Or the most prevalent. Individual versions of that, why would scientists be cooking up the data for money, for profit, for grants, for ideological reasons, because we're all crazy Marxist ideologues, and we love climate change because you get to stick it up fossil fuel companies. Oh yeah, this is a fairly niche conspiracy theory from Donald Trump back in the day about the origin story of climate science. This is 2012. So 4 years later, this guy becomes the most powerful person on the planet, right? That's actually, Donald Trump's sort of like a conspiracy theory hipster. He tends to gravitate towards really niche conspiracy theories. This is a more mainstream conservative conspiracy theory, which is governments sort of know it's not a thing or it's not a big deal, but they love it anyway because they get to control you. Right? They get to regulate you and tax you and all the stuff that governments love to do. Don't let them do that, right? So I don't want to talk about any of those individual conspiracy theories. Let's go back to the broader worldview. How do you measure that? Like, there's a couple of ways. The way that I did, Steve Lewandowski started doing this, is you just ask people the extent to which they endorse various more famous conspiracy theories. Okay. Was Princess Diana killed by MI5, the New World Order one, JFK, and the soft version of the 9/11 insider one, which is that America didn't do it to themselves, but they sort of knew it was going to happen and they let it happen to have an excuse to invade the Middle East. Very world famous. I think overall there was probably like the average was around the midpoint. But the key point here is that if you believe one, you're more likely to believe the others. Very highly correlated. I think the alpha of this scale is 0.8. You can just average belief in these conspiracies together and get a single score, which represents the extent to which you have a conspiracist worldview. And remember, we picked conspiracy theories that had nothing to do with science. Right? And so my question was, to what extent does that number predict climate change skepticism? Right? We did this around the world. And again, a fussy graph, but here's the headline. Right? There's no relationship at all. Well, actually, that's not true. In America, there was a fairly small relationship that was significant. I think there's one other country there we found it, but in 23 out of 25 countries, there's no relationship. And this is blowing my mind. Like, how can you simultaneously believe all these conspiracy theories about climate science and not really be a conspiracy theorist at heart, right? That's what I'm hearing. For me, and I can't prove it, like at some point in this world, you have to go beyond standard definitions of causality and burden of proof. This is just me leveling with you. like what I interpret this as, do I have a slide on this? Yeah. That the conspiracy worldview or the conspiracy theories aren't driving the climate skepticism. It's working the other way around. Right? That people have got a climate skeptical view, it's an intuition or a preferred conclusion, or their identity leads them to that. And in a process of motivated reasoning, they're casting around for anything that's a post hoc rationalization of that view. And in doing that, they grab onto conspiracy theories that are specific to climate change. Right? That's the only way I can. After I saw my own data, I was like, I'm not going to try and rebut people's conspiracy theories around climate change because I no longer believe it's causing the problem. It's a symptom of a deeper problem. And that's not true with every science issue. Okay, so what we have here is belief in those 4 conspiracy theories predicting climate skepticism. It's a zero correlation. I'm going to show you the same data set, exactly the same predictor, just this time we're asking about anti-vax views, right? And it's a totally different story. It's wildly significant in every one of the 25 countries. In the West in particular, like you can predict with some confidence whether someone's anti-vax from knowing whether they think Princess Diana was murdered. Like it's insane. I couldn't believe these correlations, right? So the Venn diagrams between the conspiracy worldview and anti-vax are very, very overlapping. Again, I don't want to use the language of causality because these are correlations, but I believe that it's the worldview that's causing this to a degree, right? And I'm not going to digress and talk about vax, but we're not seeing that with climate change. We are seeing it with certain solutions to climate change though. And this is like fairly fresh data. It comes out of Germany. And again, one of those things where you're like, what, really? Like I just didn't see this coming. It was sort of an accident. We ended up doing 8 studies on this, but I'm just going to show you the headline, right? So obviously, if you're going to mitigate climate change, wind farms are going to be a big part of the solution. So we measured a bunch of things to predict opposition to wind farms. This is how we measured it. It's like, you know, it's a hypothetical situation. There's these 5 wind turbines being planned for your hometown. In parts of Germany, they have municipal elections where you can decide whether you want these wind farms, etc. And so it was like, how would you vote if that was the proposal? So this is the DV, or the outcome measure. This is a measure of the conspiracy worldview that's different from the one I just showed you. This time, there's no mention of any specific conspiracy theory. It's just abstract measures about the extent to which the system is rigged in favor of elites. And what we found was that there was this huge relationship between that conspiracy mentality and opposition to wind farms. Remember that measure of conspiracy mentality didn't make any reference to wind farms, the environment, science, or anything, right? It's just a general measure. I was struck, this is regressions, just how big this relationship is. Conservatives in Germany are also more opposed to wind farms, but it underpredicts by, you know, several fold, right? And here are the other predictors, really not much going on. So we're doing kind of stuff now, just trying to drill down into what the anatomy of that process is. What is it about conspiracy theorists that they've suddenly got an issue with wind farms? Because I suspect if you did this 10 years ago, you wouldn't find this effect. I think this is a relatively new phenomenon. But it's not something that's been anticipated in the literature. It's sort of interesting. And I can riff about that afterwards if you like. All right. So basically, that whole digression about conspiracy theories is to say, keep an eye out for the wind farms, but also, to me, they become relevant insofar as they're symptoms of a deeper problem, which are probably caused by certain ideology and other types of vested interests. Anyway, just going back to that original question, should we be focusing on the collective or focusing on the individual? This is where I plan to kind of land before I start talking about solutions. Is that here's where I think the alliance is. You have these collective level vested interests that are engaging in bullshit, right? They're engaged, they're funding campaigns for misinformation. They're trying to coach people to see this through the lens of ideology and identity and political loyalty instead of through science. But my argument is that that only works because people let it work. On some level, there's people who find that a convenient message as well, because they themselves have vested interests. Individuals don't want to change. Individuals don't want to sacrifice. Individuals don't want to lose money. So and individuals have got their own ideological vested interests, right? And so they enable and reward those collective interests, okay? So not just the industrial vested interests, but the political opportunists that make capital out of this, right, are rewarded by people for doing that. And you see this cycle, like a toxic cycle. So sometimes I hear people saying, like, basically, poor citizens of Australia were just manipulated and abused by governments and industry. I'm like, no, that is not what's happening, because Australians are rewarding government industry for doing that over and over and over again, right? So where the interventions have to be, you know, at both levels, it should be able to snap that cycle. Okay. Oh, that's just Greta Thunberg saying pretty much what I've said. Last half hour. Look, I've put it like pivot and talk about solutions. Like, what if you accept that we live in this polarized world, this culture wars world? What do you do about it? Okay, here's various options. One is you just engage in revolution. You smash the system. Yeah. And I'm actually, I got invited onto this paper by a bunch of critical geographers. And we've got this paper where we make this case. My one contribution that survived, they hated my ideas and wrote them all out of the paper. And probably later on, you'll see why. The one idea that I had in this paper that stayed was trying to reclaim the word radical, right? Which is sometimes has this sense of being ridiculous and over the top and extreme and implausible, or sometimes the geoengineering world talk about, you know, radical technologies in this buzzy way. The origin of the word radical comes from a Latin term, Carlos or something like that. The word radish comes from the same thing. It means of the root, right? It means something of the essence. And so a radical response to climate change should be something that attacks the root cause drivers of climate change. And so that's what we're doing in this paper. There's this hierarchy of radical responses, and they set a high bar, right? They really hate I shouldn't say they, I'm on this paper too. The geoengineering solutions, like band-aid solutions in their mind, that's like especially negative. Hopeful solutions, they would describe as things like clean energy targets and stuff like that. So like well-meaning kind of targets, but maybe not as effective, can't be scaled up to the level they need to be. This is where a lot of my left-wing social psych buddies are. The tactical solutions are things like community activism, scientific disobedience and dissent. This is like banning fossil fuels, right? It's only fourth. So this is banning fossil fuels without dealing with the deeper structures that underpin them. This is about reforming democracy, eliminating corruption, etc. You know, like eliminating state capture from industries and bringing transparency back to democracy. And this is basically just overturning capitalism. Right? So just fundamental root and branch restructuring of the growth-oriented mindset and the exploitative extractive systems that we normalize, right? So I'll leave that with you. I'm on the paper. It's very easy to write this stuff. I mean, my hesitation was like, you can call for revolution, that's fine. You know, I sort of agree on fundamental levels, but just the timelines. While we're doing that, you know, we've got this thing hurtling towards us pretty soon. Maybe it's already passed, but anyway, we don't have a lot of time. So a lot of the other things I'll be talking about is really like, how do you decarbonize in a polarized climate quickly? And this isn't stuff that I do myself, but since I migrated from a school of psychology to a business school, I just loved hearing about all this stuff. People in the room would know this better than I. But it was really interesting, like talking to industry in Australia, because there was this point, and you could just almost like smell it. There was this point where everyone collectively panicked. Because right up to that point, I think industry had been able to run these campaigns of misinformation and delaying tactics. And then there was like a decade or two of greenwashing, bullshit, empty words. And then a whole bunch of things happened at once. And part of that was EU climate laws. The EU, people don't vote them in necessarily. So they're free to do their kind of stuff. And they've been really strong on climate change stuff. And a lot of big business in Australia suddenly realized they can't do international trade anymore if they don't get their house in order. That was a shock to them. Climate litigation. Over here, Australia is, I think, the per capita, the most climate litigious country in the world, and it's actually working. And I tell you what, nothing gets the attention of board members more than the fear that they're going to be sued down the track, that their legacy will be tainted. They get the fear in their belly. Right? So they definitely pay attention to this. And then big activists, hedge fund investors, particularly in New York and California, there's people who control billions and billions of dollars and increasingly are setting trends and directing money away from dirty industries, etc. So it's increasingly difficult to get funding for big, ambitious things. There's nothing psychological about any of this. This is not soft power. This is not persuasion. This is not reason. This is hard power turning on hard power. And it's kind of thrilling. And when I feel hope, it's because of this kind of stuff. Reforming the political system. I mean, everyone who talks about this has the same recommendation around this. This is sort of creepy when my brother-in-law is involved in the energy industry, and he said, yeah, this is exactly how it works. There's 3 jobs that you get in that world. You're either, working as a lobbyist for industry, or you're working in government, or you're part of the regulation kind of mechanism, right? And then people rotate around those jobs in their careers. They probably touch base with each one of those. This is the lowest paid job. This is the second lowest paid job. This is the most low paid job. Right? And so it's not hard to imagine how that can corrupt the process, right? I'm not saying people are corrupt explicitly and knowingly. I'm just saying this culture of mateship develops. These people used to be colleagues of these people, used to be colleagues of these people. You don't want to ask inconvenient questions or upset people here because you might want to migrate from there to there or there to there. It's a problem. And it's a fixable problem. There was efforts made to reduce the revolving door in the tobacco industry, like in the 90s, and they seem to be able to do it. Actually, China's one, just a few years back, overnight. It was like, if you worked in government, you can no longer work in industry and vice versa. They just did it overnight. So it can be done with political will. Speaking of politics, apologies for anyone new to Australia, but I'm going to nerd out about Australian politics. But for those of you who were here last year, you remember the election, and this is a pivotal election. Most famous for the teal quake, right? So just to remind you, 6 independents were all funded by Simon Holmes à Court, one of the richest guys in Australia. Teal being a combination of blue, which is the colour of the Conservative Party, and green for environmentalism. And they all had the same 3 policies, and one of them was action on climate change. And they ran in some of the most conservative seats in Australia. So some of these seats had never not voted Conservative in 100 years, right? And they all won, some of them with double-digit swings. You don't often see that in Australia, which is a fairly incremental kind of political scene. So what is going on there? And like, when I look at what Simon Holmes à Court did, I'm like, oh, that's so impressive from an identity sort of jujitsu point of view. I was talking about jujitsu yesterday. But the genius here is to create a third way, like an option for Conservatives to go. Conservatives whose families have voted Conservative their entire life will never vote for the left-wing parties, right? For Green or Labor. That's just not in their DNA. It just feels gross to them, right? So they created this third way, like this clean skin identity where you can park your vote, right? Without seeming like you're betraying your identity. So that's brilliant, right? And there's an old political science sort of insight that to defeat the enemy, you don't have to convert them to your cause. You have to just get them to defect, right? So this is a brilliant way of getting the Conservatives to defect. The other thing is playing up on this populist thing, right? These 6 insiders, they're not real politicians, right? That's how they're branded. They're all selected from the community. And the narrative was that they're outside the system looking to reform the system. This is a classic populist narrative. Trump does the same thing, right? So you're stitching up the conservative thing and you're stitching up the populist thing. None of it was accidental. It was very mindful, very psychological, and very effective. And it was funny seeing I wrote a piece around this in Nature Climate Change, just riffing about it, but it was funny watching the conservative pushback about, this is billionaires buying votes. This is corrupting democracy. I'm like, yeah, but finally, like, this is no longer asymmetrical. It's happening on both sides, right? And I'm all for it. Alliance building within existing systems. This is probably what I've done most of my research on. And, I talked about jujitsu yesterday, but the notion here is that this is just communication 101. If you want to reach conservatives, your conservatives are the problem, and you want to reach them. You've got to create a conservative case for climate change. You have to use language that conservatives identify with. You can't just mash data in people's faces and expect that to be transformative. And you can't bang on about harm and justice, harm and justice, harm and justice, because these are things that left-wing people intuitively resonate with, but it's foolish to think that everyone's going to resonate with the same things. And so there's a whole bunch of data that makes this case that you can use more conservative language to make a case for climate change, and it's more likely to capture their attention. Some of this is my own data, but things like, you know, energy security is something that conservatives care about, protecting a way of life, patriotism, green technology, green innovation, climate change as an expression of personal responsibility, or talking about free market friendly solutions. These things are more likely to bring conservatives with them. When I present this to my social science buddies, 50% of them usually are on board with me, 50% of them are horrified. This is exactly the stuff that the critical geographers didn't want to have, right? But anyway, I'll leave it with you. The other thing is that these cases have to be made by other conservatives. And I've got a long history of looking at messenger effects, usually in these tribalized worlds around trust-sensitive messages. And it just blows me away. I've been doing this all my career with various things, but it's incredible the size of these effects. When you've got these tribalized environments, the messages have to come from in-group members. And it's like confronting for someone like me, because it says I have to step away from the microphone. I'm the last person to talk about this stuff, right? Because I'm a greenie, city-dwelling academic. But you know, there's a lot of data. Conservatives are influenced by conservatives. Rural people are influenced by rural people. And that's fine. There's heaps of conservatives around making the case, right? They need to be empowered. They're the ones who are going to make the change. And then there's psychological tools that rise above ideology. This is one of the reasons everyone loves norms, because it appeals to that universal need to be liked and to fit in. It's not captive to ideology so much. Outside psychology and social sciences, a lot of the critical scholars talk about practice and process theory. It's really about structuring your environment, structuring society, so that it's in the DNA of how you live that you're more sustainable. It's not a cost-benefit analysis. You're not mindful of doing it. It's just part of your habits becomes being sustainable. And then just a few days ago, I thought I'll just riff about record-breaking temperatures. And the reason I want to do that, partly because of this graph, which just freaks me out. I mean, people in this room be well aware, right? But this is monthly global temperatures in the last few years, well, the last few decades, each month. And it's just a mess of squiggles. But look at that black bar at the top, right? So what's this? This is June, which is freakishly hot. And this was July, that I think was the hottest month on the planet at that point. And then just a few weeks ago, the September data came in. And that's one of the most terrifying charts I've ever seen. And I've actually got data that speaks circumstantially to this. You know, remember Central Research handed over all their data on this. So I've got 25 polls from 2009 to 2019. This is what it looks like. These are all the polls. This is people who believe in anthropogenic climate change, and it's trending upwards from a horribly low base, and it peters out at a horribly low level. But anyway, it zigzags around a little bit. So I was curious about what might explain those variations and whether Australia is skeptical. And the big thing that popped out, and I'm not going to show the multi-level modeling and all that. This is just a scatter plot. Each one of these dots is 1,000 people. So this is a mean score from a poll. This is the level of skepticism in that poll. This is the global temperatures the previous year. The hotter the global temperature the previous year, the less skeptical Australia was. What interested me about that is that if you replace the previous year with the current year, it doesn't work so well. If you replace global temperatures with Australian temperatures, it doesn't work so well. If you look at whether they filled the survey out in winter or summer or spring, it has no effect at all. It's not about people's experience of heat. It's about knowing that it's getting hotter. This simple heuristic, informational heuristic, seems to correlationally, have an effect. And particularly for conservatives, the strongest for conservatives. And this is my last slide, but this sense of why would that be cutting through if it is in fact, I just wrote this slide a few days ago. This is just in the spirit of freewheeling with you guys. I think the advantage of this information is that it's immediate. You can no longer say this is a hypothetical thing in the future, like this is happening now. There's nothing like it in human psychology than thinking something's happening now. Suddenly our risk, analysis shifts. It's frightening, and I've got theories around fear. I don't want to digress too much, but there's a bit of a trend out there. Don't go down the fear messages because it'll be paralyzing. People retreat into denial if there's too much fear. I'm like, that is not true. Fear is the biggest motivator of action on this planet. I firmly believe that. There's no data that suggests otherwise, right? Actual fear in the belly. You're scared. That motivates action. And it's sourceless. It's not coming from a person. It's not an argument. It's not a message that people are making that could be argued. It's the planet speaking. It's just data. Right? And so I think that's my hokey way of making sense why that might be, if there is an informational intervention, why that might be our best one. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Matthew. That was stirring stuff and a roller coaster of a ride. Has anyone got any questions that they would like to ask?
Thanks so much. I have a question about the fear campaign, the final slide. I'm not sure first if it's successful, and if it is, is it not changing one problem with causing another problem? With this fear message, it might cause lots of anxiety, depression, and lots of health issues. I mean, how can we make a balance here to cause an action if it does, and also to...
I'm not saying to scare people unnecessarily. I'm not saying to have apocalyptic messages that are actually like the reality plus 20%. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the actual reality of the situation should be scary to people. The problem is when I talk about this is that most people I talk to are concerned about the planet and the climate activists themselves, and they're scared, and they're also bordering on depressed. Right? There's huge clinical problems among people who care about climate change. This is true of them, and it's true of all their friends too. And so in their bubble, they're like, we need these optimistic messages. And I agree. Like, give them all the optimistic messages they need to keep them afloat, to keep coming back. But I'm saying that the vast majority of the population are not scared about climate change. I'm sorry, they're not. I don't see that in the data. And I'm not talking about concern about climate change, which is an abstract thing, like I'm concerned about world hunger, or I'm concerned about malaria in Africa. So it's like fear, not feeling it around climate change. When they do feel fear, they act. And there's no data that I can see, and I dare anyone to disagree, that says that fear makes people retreat from the climate change message. What I witnessed with COVID when people are scared is that all this stuff that we say is too hard to do with climate change happened overnight. Much more dramatically even than we're asking in climate change debate. And 10 years ago in Australia, there was such a massive drought, it looked like we were going to run out of water, right? And I live in a very conservative part of the world. And it looked like the dams were running out. This is scary. It's like, what if the water runs out? And what happened? People went crazy. People lobbied the government to regulate them even more. They regulated each other. There was like naming and shaming and of neighbors for having green lawns, and people had to defensively say why their lawns are green because they've got tanks, and like there was so much political capital about having more and more severe regulations. And the conservatives were way on board with it. Everyone was, because they were scared. That's not happening with climate change.
The thing is that even in the case of COVID, there are lots of studies showing that the negative framing or the fear framing of the messages is not quite successful in making people to do the vaccination more often.
Yeah, I think with vaccination and climate change, I've reached this point where we post the idea that if you have like experiment with the single shot communication message, that you're going to see shifts, right? So, because these are very well rehearsed kind of attitudes. All I know is that all the governments, including the conservative ones, were rewarded for regulating us around COVID, for shutting down industry, for shutting down borders. And that was political gold for them, and they did it, right? Because the population rewarded them for that because they were scared. Right? So I know that's what happens when people are scared. That's my theory. Are you all talking about fear? I'll just...
I completely agree with you that fear is a very, potent motivator, and also completely agree with you that we need a very radical change and overturn of that. Probably around 10 years ago, David Suzuki was visiting Australia, and he gave a talk at UNSW, and I do remember what he said, and he said, we only need like clean water and clean air, and this capitalism, endless profit and endless growth mindset is jeopardizing that, and jeopardizing that really quickly. That sort of like essential resources of just really clean air and clean water are just becoming so scarce, and they get polluted. They make the ice caps on Himalayas darker, it melts faster, and this is going to happen soon. So why is that not? I mean, can this sort of like, can we move from sort of like debating who has caused it and how did it come about? Maybe it's coming about by completely natural whatever kind of antecedents and so, but the consequences are such that they are frightening. So do you think that would probably be more effective, or that people would, those who doubt current state of the debate, would just doubt the messaging that indeed we are going to run out of clean water,
Yeah, I think that
clean air soon?
it's like the first wave of climate denial or climate contrarianism was saying the temperatures aren't going up. When it became obvious the temperatures were going up, they pivoted towards it's going up, but it's not humans primarily responsible for it, which is where a lot of Australians are stuck. In most parts of the world, there's a third wave where they say, well, yeah, this is happening and we're responsible for it, but is it going to be so bad? Like, aren't the consequences been exaggerated? Or aren't these solutions that you think are going to be work actually kind of ineffective? And a whole bunch of delaying discourses that combine to say we don't really need to change right now. That's a much more sophisticated kind of view. And so that's, to me, where the climate wars are now, like how severe are the consequences going to be? And, I feel as though I've given up on thinking we can just rely on the community to internalize this. Because by the time that it's there in people's backyards and they're feeling personally inconvenienced, it's going to be too late. So that's why I get hope really about these top-down hard power messages, where there's people who do know, and they create the laws and they direct the finance in a way that drives change through coercion.
Cool.
Sam was next, and then Tim, and then.
Do you suspect there would be a relationship between the kinds of interventions someone would find palatable and this kind of conspiracist worldview that you mentioned? Because something like radical action, radical revolutionary action, seems like it would be kind of appealing to someone who believes in this global.
Smash the system, yeah. So the short answer is I don't know. I don't know the answer to your question. Like, as I say, I don't think that the conspiracist worldview is a big predictor of climate skepticism, so I haven't really thought about it that much. But the conspiracist worldview is disproportionately represented among the far left and the far right. And so you see this weird alignment where the loop kind of, the snake eats the tail kind of thing, where the far left and the far right to conspire to agree that the system is corrupt and needs to be smashed, right? And there was an awful lot of Bernie Sanders supporters that vote to Trump because they both have that kind of. So yeah, I mean, to me, the smash the system message is, I'm nervous about it as a message that it's hard enough to get people on board with the need to do pragmatic things right now, pay 2% more for their energy or whatever. It's hard enough to do that than to convince them that growth is a problem, that capitalism is a problem. I just feel like if you're trying to launch too many ideological ships at once, then yeah, it's probably bound to fail. So that's my reservation, even though I agree that fundamentally nothing's going to change unless we retool the basis for our economies. Unless one of these geoengineering solutions pays off, but there's no evidence that it can be scaled up just yet.
Hi, thank you so much for that insightful presentation. My question is, there is a growing skepticism on us achieving net zero targets, and whether that would impact, on the initiatives that are being put forward, or is that target just delusional? What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I'm not in a position to judge. When I talk to people who are in a better position to judge, I was talking to one of them, and this is Chris Gregg. He does the Net Zero America, Net Zero Australia thing, where they try and model this radical granularity, what it would actually look like to be net zero by 2050. He thinks that we've got a shot at 2100, but there's a sense that 2050 is completely delusional. And when you look at what he does, what that world would look like, even if you took away all of the ideological headwinds, all the political opportunism, all the identity crap, took all of that away and we were just as a planet trying to do this thing pragmatically, there's huge problems with availability of rare minerals that are required to build up all the alternative energies. There's huge problems with the availability of labor to do that. Even in Australia, like imagine how long it would take. They were talking about 6 solar farms the size of Tasmania. Like in the center of Australia, it would be like one way Australia could decarbonize. I mean, imagine what that would look like, or even just the land rights debates around that alone, and all the regulatory processes, etc. Is it on the timeline that we need to decarbonize by 2050? These targets were frequently set in an era of consequence-free kind of virtue signaling. So you see CEOs sort of set these types of targets, probably aware that they're not going to be around to pay the consequences if it doesn't happen. Look, my fear, I don't know if I want to read too much. My fear is that in the future, climate contrarians are going to look and sound like us. Everyone's going to be saying, yeah, we care about this, we're on your side, let's do this together. There'll be all sorts of ways of unraveling the progress in a way that's convenient for industry and government, whether it's through greenwashing and creative accounting or whatever it is. And that everyone's going to meet these targets through creative accounting in some abstract way, but actually the temperatures are just going to keep going up because the carbon emissions are going to keep going up. That's my fear. So that's why I look to the accountants and the finance people to have these transparent, non-gameable, concrete ways of tracking progress. Because without that, it's in the world of PR.
Which is interesting because I'm an accountant.
Yeah, I love what that's where I think the action is. Just keeping them accountable. Keeping them accountable.
Question?
Matt, just going back to fear, I thought it's worth noting that if you think about apolitical issues like governments trying to stop people from smoking or stop people from speeding, the advertising, at least in Australia, is heavily fear-based, like better late than dead, here's what your lung's going to look like, etc. Very like confronting, grotesque imagery. And I'm not an expert in the area, I'm sure you know more, but that must be based on something, I would imagine, that fear is a motivator to change behavior.
Yeah, well, I just think to me, it's obvious. Now, the narrative, one of the most famous insights in the health literature is that it can backfire if you don't give them concrete ways of changing, right? So fear in the absence of concrete behavioral change can make people just go, oh, this is too hard, right? Now, in the climate change sense, we know what to do, right? And so I don't think that that's necessarily a problem. I feel like the analogs with things like eating and smoking are a little bit complex because the problem is also therapeutic for people. So dealing with anxiety, people overeat, people dealing with anxiety, people smoke more and stuff. And so you get this particularly complex psychological cycles to make it hard, and it needs to be navigated through really carefully. But I don't see that so much in climate change. Look, I'm not saying that fear messages are necessarily the way. I mean, but I think people need to feel the fear. Like, that's not a fear message. I'm not trying to mash fear into your face. So I think whatever it takes to get people to internalize the fear, I think it's going to be powerful. But I think people express concern in a way that, yeah, I'm concerned about climate change. I just don't want to pay $10 a week more for it, right? That's not what people do when they're afraid.
Yeah. Related to that, right? So people that seem to be afraid of other things at the moment, right? So that circle that you presented, where if people vote green, and then well, there'll be regulations, and then the companies rattle their fear drums and say, well, we'll lay people off, and so they are mortified by sort of the everyday fears of economic hardship. And so through those fears, so how can we break those fears so that they can actually be afraid of the things they should be afraid of?
That's such a great question, because I don't know. Like if you look at, Queensland is like, Australia is the biggest exporter of coal in the world. A lot of it comes out of Queensland and New South Wales, but the mining industries and the towns that are attached to them are some of the most economically fragile parts of the country. Right? And so they quite rightly, I think, fear that it's an existential threat for them. And I get annoyed when people like me or people in my world sitting in the city just go, why are we talking about sacrifice? This is a no-brainer. That's all just propaganda. I'm like, no, that's not real talk. Like, I feel like there needs to be real talk about this. So if we can calm people's nerves that their futures are certain, even if we totally pivot the economy, I I think that's going to help because that's a deeper fear than what's happening globally. But then the answer to that question, you know, there's a trust issue there. And governments like, trust us, will look after you. It's like, you in the city who don't really understand us, don't really care about us, and on some level don't even really like us, are telling me it's okay. It's a really tricky message. So I think that in dealing with rural people, dealing with conservatives, there has to be a strong, compassionate engagement that's underpinned by real talk and real understanding, and a communication of liking. And I think that's those messenger effects, why the conservatives influence conservatives and why rural people influence rural, is they can communicate that in a way that I can't. I can tell them that, they're never going to believe me.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Well, it's got to be quick.
I'm still a little bit concerned about the fear kind of messaging. What is the scariest thing? Experiencing one of the extreme weather events. That's the scariest thing that someone can experience. That's really frightening. And still, that one, you showed that this is not enough to make people believe in climate change. So how does a messaging work, but the direct experience doesn't work?
Yeah, well, I mean, the message is that it's not a climate change related issue and it's political to talk like that, right? And that's how the conservatives talk, like around the bushfires. Let's not get political here. Okay. The people who drew it into a political question are saying, let's not talk about this because it's political. Anyway, I feel as though if people's summers are routinely ruined by smoke and they can't go out and they have to live indoor lives, I think that's probably the most likely thing. But the irony of all this is that in Australia, the most urbanized country in the world, one of the richest countries in the world, objectively, we probably do have less to fear around climate change than some other countries that are more vulnerable. Anyway, thank you.
On that positive.
Yes.
Well, let's thank Matthew for a terrific talk, and